Stacey Murphy here with a video on keeping your plants healthy. So what should you do after you seed and plant your crops? What are some successful techniques that will take you from these baby and teenager plants into a successful harvest? So the goal here is to keep the plants as healthy as possible, right? And so your agenda for 40 days, your commitment is these 5 things: checking moisture, observing the color of the leaves, observing the growth of the plant, observing for potential pests, and tracking your progress with images and journals. So here's what that looks like. We've already talked about committing to watering for 40 days by hand so that you get a sense of what soil moisture should look like for your crops. So you're going to check your soil moisture daily. So go ahead and review that video. I won't go into that in this video again. So step number 2 is to observe the color of the leaves. So your leaves generally are green, and they are various shades of green. Sometimes your green beans are a slightly lighter shade of green than, say, your kale leaves, right? But they should be fairly green, and if they are a different color, purplish or yellowish or bluish, that usually signifies that they have some sort of nutrient deficiency. This is if the whole leaf is showing those signs. So this is something that is happening in your soil essentially, and basically what you're doing when you're setting up your beds, and something that we've already done, is we've added compost to our soil biology, and that soil biology is what delivers nutrients to your crops. So if we've set up our bed well, then the hope is that we won't see these nutrient deficiencies. And sometimes it still happens, but when you're setting up a new bed, oftentimes there are a lot of nutrients available for the plants, and so you don't really experience those nutrient deficiencies. But you still want to observe and just double check to see what you're noticing. Now, when I say these things are possible nutrient deficiencies, and you can see different variations of yellowing and browning and purpling and bluing here and curling, they might not be nutrient deficiencies. It may just be sometimes the lower leaves of the plant, if they get wet a lot, sometimes they will turn yellow, and it's basically like a fungal growth on that leaf, and you just want to remove that leaf, and you won't see any more of that on the leaves above. So what I want you to do is, before you try fixing your soil by adding some kind of nutrient, like looking at the leaves and saying it looks like an iron deficiency, I'm going to go get something with iron in it. Before you try to fix it, please post a couple good photos in the Facebook forum for us to look at, or send photos to me through email, just to get a second opinion before you make any big decisions. Because altering your soil, you can pull those nutrients out of whack pretty easily, and it's something that I would recommend that once you start gardening, you dive deeper into soil biology to understand those nutrients. But for now, don't worry about them so much in your first 40 days. With greens, it's usually not that big of an issue. Typically, you'll see this more for crops like tomatoes and cucumbers. Okay, so that's observing the leaves. Notice them, track them. If you are having any issues, do something about it right away. Take a photo and show somebody. Don't wait, because it will only get worse. Okay, the third thing you want to do is observe growth, and you just want to notice when your plants really start to take off. Notice here the plant on the right is bigger than the plant on the left, the purple. They were planted at exactly the same time, and I'm actually going to pull out that purple plant because both of these are kale, and the purple just aren't growing as well as the green plants. And so just observe what's working well and what's not working well, and if something's not working, don't be shy about pulling it out and putting something else in. Okay, so observing growth also means that you're watching to make sure that something doesn't bolt. And what I mean by bolting is flowering. And this is bok choy on the screen. And you'll notice it looks a little bit like bok choy. It's got some holes in it too. But what it also is doing is it's growing vertically. And when things start to grow vertically, that's a sign that they're bolting. There's also a sign in the inside here that you can see little flowers starting to brew. And they look like little green pods coming out of the center. So that's what bolting is. This is never going to get better. What it's going to start to do is just get taller and taller and taller, and the leaves are going to become more and more bitter and fewer and farther between. So bolting is never going to get better. So you can do one of two things. You can allow it to go to seed and let it seed the next generation, but that's going to take a couple months. It's going to take a couple months for the plant to grow all the way up, for the flowers to bloom, for the seeds to form, for the plant to dry out, and for those seeds to be ready to harvest. So what I would recommend instead is just eat the plant. And it's all delicious. Even though it's bolting, it's going to be all good. So just eat the whole thing, fry it up. The other part of observing growth is knowing when to thin. And so there's that whole video, remember, about looking at your plant, looking at your rows of any root vegetables and knowing when you need to thin them out. Okay, so the fourth step is observing for pests. And I know this can be really stressful because this is the one that's harder for us to control. So the good news is that we've already done a couple things to ensure that we're keeping pests away. One is that one of the prevention strategies for keeping pests away is planting 30% herbs and flowers in your bed. So if you've already done that, that's one step that you've done to help prevent those pests. And you're basically you're inviting in beneficial insects, and some of those smells and flavors are keeping other insects away that you don't want. And the other preventative strategy that you've already employed is that you've built good soil biology. If you've added 2 inches of compost, that's what helps to keep pests and diseases at bay. This is where the plants build their immunity. And so especially if you've added any worm poop to your beds, this is something, the bacteria in it really helps prevent pests and diseases. So I highly recommend, if you haven't already found some, think about trying to find a source for that. Okay, third prevention strategy is harvest regularly. So if you take the food out of the field, the pests can't get it. So don't be worried if you have small and baby crops. When you're first getting started, harvest all those greens and get them out of the field. That means more food for your plate and less food for those pests. And as you get more experienced, you'll start to know when you can leave things in the field longer and how big things can get before pests start to get a little bit out of hand. Okay, so your first 40 days, the type of pests that you're probably going to encounter, the 3 main ones are going to be caterpillars, aphids, and slugs. There may be some other ones based on your area, but these are the ones that most people are going to see in their first 40 days if they're growing these particular crops, the greens and the root crops, because it's usually a cooler weather crops, and so these are the things you're going to see. So basically what you're doing with these is with your caterpillars, you're basically removing by hand. Aphids, you're also removing by hand or with a spray bottle. And slugs, you're basically creating some sort of trap. So I'm going to walk you through these different things. Okay, first of all, what to look for. So when you're observing for pests, you're looking for eggs, larvae, or pupa, so the insect life cycle. So on the underside of leaves, especially the cabbage family, things like cabbage and kale and collard greens, the cabbage moth will lay these tiny little eggs. That's a tiny, tiny little egg there on the left. And on the right is a Japanese beetle larva. You might see this in your soil and you want to get rid of it. So those are things to look for. These are aphids on the screen here, and on the left are cabbage aphids. They generally grow on cabbage and kale and collards. And then on the right there are just your general aphids, and they grow on pretty much any other crop. And they come in many colors, pink and green and yellow and purple and black. Okay, so when you're looking for pests, you're also looking for the moths. So those moths are the things that are laying eggs. So after a moth comes through, you might want to go check for those eggs. Okay, the other thing you're looking for, of course, are chew marks. And so here on the screen are some of the other things that you might see. You might see cucumber beetles, which can do some damage to the leaves. Generally, with the particular crops that we're working with, they won't be such an issue, but they will be when you start planting cucumbers and squash. We talked about caterpillars a bit, so you can see how they like to chew on the leaves and especially around the edges. And then flea beetles make these little tiny, tiny pock marks. They won't hurt your crop, they just make them look bad. And flea beetles are something that the only way to keep them off the crop completely is with what's called row cover. So that's something to consider if you're seeing a lot of flea beetle damage and you don't want to see it. And then spider mites is another thing you might see here. It's usually on beans and it looks like rust almost. You'd almost think this was something about the leaves, but this is actually spider mite damage. Okay, so let's do a little run through here and see if you can spot the pests. So here is one of my kale plants and I'm definitely having a caterpillar issue. So can you spot the caterpillar? There it is. They like to align themselves with the center stalk, and sometimes they camouflage themselves against it. So you want to look for that. Okay, so the next one, can you spot the pests? So you'll notice there's a couple of little dots all over these leaves. If you look closely, what you'll see is that there are eggs on the underside of one of the leaves. And the way you can tell is that there's little shadows next to them. If you zoom in, you can kind of see what those eggs look like. Now, pests are not a big deal if they're not attacking the new growth. So the new growth is at the center of the plant. As long as that's healthy, then the plant has a future. So you only really worry about when the pests are eating those inner leaves. When they're eating the outer leaves, you remove the pests, and you can even remove those leaves so that your plant looks better, and then just keep on growing. You can also look for things like tunnels. And so when you continue growing beyond 40 days, you might see things like leaf miner damage here on the right on Swiss chard or on beets. And it's basically a pest that tunnels through. Just remove those leaves, take them completely out of the garden so that that habitat goes away. The middle is the squash vine borer, happens with zucchini and summer squash. Very challenging little bugger to battle. And the carrot weevil on the left, not very common, but if you see holes in your carrots, that might be what's happening. Now, a really great pest identification source is this book, this Organic Gardener's Handbook of Natural Insect and Disease Control. And there's also this link to different images so you can identify what kind of pests you have. Okay, so let's go out in the field and take a look at these caterpillars and these aphids and what to do.
So if I was doing a quick check for cabbage moth caterpillars, I would basically look at the underside to see if there was any eggs. And sometimes I'll go through and I'll just rub the underside, just because if there are any eggs, that'll mean that they'll come off. And then I also take a look. This plant has down at its base, and maybe it's hard to see this, I'll pull this leaf off. This is one of the small leaves at the center, and it's been eaten up quite a bit. So this means that the caterpillar is starting to get to the center of the plant, so I really need to find this caterpillar before it eats my whole plant. All right, so if I'm looking for my caterpillars, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for the leaves with holes in them. I know that there's got to be a caterpillar somewhere. There is not on this leaf, but if I look on this other leaf where it's got lots of holes in it, I know that I can probably find the caterpillar somewhere here. And sure enough, if you flip it over to the back side, this leaf has 3 caterpillars on it. I can't quite get the leaf all the way into the camera, but 1, 2, and 3 caterpillars, if you guys can see those. So all I need to do is basically take that caterpillar, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw it out of my garden. You can do multiple things with these. You can put them in soapy water to kill them. You can break them in half. I like to just get them off my plant and just put them somewhere else and get them off my food. They cannot get back on that way. Okay, so essentially what you want to do, you have your spray bottle. And I like spray bottles that have adjustable settings, so you can spray a stream or something that is more flowy. So I like to set it to stream so that when I spray, it hits it really hard. All right, now what that does is if I look at the plant and I see an aphid, I can pick the aphid off if it's just one. If there's lots of them, I can use the spray bottle to do it. And I want to look at the underside because that's really where the aphids are going to show up. There's none here, but I'm just showing you for purposes. So what I like to do is if there's a lot of them, as I spray, I rub, and that's going to basically rub them onto the ground. And all you have to do with aphids is get them off the plant, because once they're off the plant, they really won't get back up on the plant. And in 40 days, you probably won't encounter very many aphids.
All right, so that leaves slugs. What do you do about slugs? And so usually people who have to worry about slugs are people who live in wet climates, or if they have a lot of debris. So slugs like to eat decaying plant matter, which means that if you have a lot of mulch that is very close to your plants, that those slugs will be eating the mulch and then they'll jump onto your plant. So that's no good. So you want to leave a little space around your mulch. And 2 things that you can do to deter slugs if you end up with them. I've heard, and this is through the grapevine, I've never had to deal with them personally. Eggshells are something that people say deters the slugs. Crush them up. You want to wash the eggshells first and make sure that there's no bacteria in them, and then basically crush them in your hand and put them around the plant. And then the other thing is a beer trap, and this is something that has some beer in it, and basically the idea is that the slug crawls in. And what you want to do is with the beer trap, the only way that you can use this to capture the slugs is if you go out at like 5 a.m. That's when they're still in the beer, and basically pick them out and get them out of your garden. That's the only way to get them out. It's basically like a trap, and then you're basically removing the slugs from your garden. So that's 2 ways to think about slugs. And what you want to remember is that seasonal data is really important when you're gardening. And so if you can track when these things are happening, then these same things might happen next year. So there in your workbook, there is a pest and disease notes area where you can basically track whether or not you saw some pests, what level they were, whether or not they affected the harvest, whether or not they killed the plant, and what date it was. And if you track that data, then it will help you next year. And the idea here is if you're out there at least once a week noticing things, you're not going to have a pest infestation. You're just going to get a couple pests and you're going to get rid of them, and it's going to be no big deal. So I know you can do it. It's not a whole lot that you have to worry about while you're waiting for your food, but you do have to go and check periodically. Now, this video is too short to cover mammal pressure, but if you have any one of these animals going after your garden, you probably need some sort of barrier. And you have to know a little bit about the animal in order to build that barrier. Okay, so the last thing that you want to do is you want to take photos and journal your progress so that next year you have a notebook and you understand what went well and you can make decisions. And so the other thing that you can do with those is you can post them to our Facebook group if you're a part of the Facebook group, or send your photos to me so that I can take a look and see how things are going. Everybody loves to brag about their garden, right? And the last thing I want to say is that these 5 simple steps that you're doing between when you plant and when you harvest, you're really not doing that much. You're going to feel probably if you created a soil bed that was really fertile with a lot of beautiful compost and a lot of organic matter, then this part of the game is really simple and straightforward, and you're going to feel like you're not doing a whole lot. So all I recommend is just giving a little love and attention each day, even if it's just noticing, looking out at the garden and seeing what things look like. All right, that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next.